Begitu dekat namun begitu jauh. So close yet so far. And I think, and especially for the Indonesia under 23 national team, very, very, very far. Because for all the naturalization that Indonesia has introduced, not just to the men's side, but also for the women's national team, Indonesia were hotly tipped to be one of the contenders, not just for, I mean, if not for the World Cup qualification, but also in the SEA Games. But in the end, it was a case of debts, really, where the men under Patrick Kluivert, who could not bring the Garudas beyond the fourth round of the 2026 World Cup Asian qualifying, but also, unfortunately for Indira Sajari, he also was unable to help the young Garudas mount a credible title defense of their Southeast Asian Games gold gold medal in the men's football that they won in 2023 in Cambodia, instead crashing out at the group stage. And as for the women, they were also slightly better, but this was thanks to the influx of more heritage players for the women's national team this year, despite them not having an organized league for the Indonesian women throughout this whole year or even the season. So it was these naturalized players that got them over the line for the women's SEA Games football tournament group stage, but eventually finished fourth after they lost to Thailand in the bronze medal playoff. So for the men's national team, it's really a case of they got so many Dutch heritage players in the squad. They brought in Patrick Kluivert after PSSI sacked Shin Tae-yong at the start of the year. And although the Garudas recorded World Cup qualifying victories over China and Bahrain to keep their slim World Cup hopes alive, but that was as good as they got because under the Dutch coaching contingent, whether it was for the men's senior national team or the under 23s, they were really unable to go far. At the next hurdle, the weaknesses in Kluivert's coaching or the Kluivert coaching staff saw the Indonesians exposed as they lost to Saudi Arabia and Iraq to see their World Cup hopes go up in smoke, and also for the under 23s in their AFF under 23 championship, where they only won silver on home soil, losing to Vietnam in the final, and also missing out on the qualification for the AFC under 23 Asian Cup finals in 2026 in Saudi Arabia, and which saw their Dutch head coach Gerald van den Berg fired after their failure to produce results in both these tournaments. So the coach who helmed the young Garudas to victory in the 2023 SEA Games was recalled, and unfortunately, despite having a few naturalized Dutch-born players in the side, Eva Jenner, Rafael Struck, who are already fully capped international players, and also a number of them who actually also featured for Shin Tae-yong in the ASEAN Championships in 2024. Despite having that bolstering of talent and having quite a number of friendlies, they fell real short as they exited the group stage, missing out as the best runner-up to Malaysia by just one goal in their 3-1 victory over Myanmar, after they suffered a shock 0-1 loss to the Philippines in their opening group game. And to compound matters, it did not help that Indonesia struggled to find a cohesive approach, which was previously nurtured under Shin Tae-yong when he was in charge of both the men's main national team and the under 23s. So that saw the Garudas struggle all round under the Dutch system, and that saw them eventually collapse to end the whole year without any silverware. Now, for the women, For the women themselves, they actually did not do well in they fared little better actually when it came to the AFC Women's Asian Cup qualification, winning only one game out of three, losing to Pakistan and Chinese Taipei, but with a narrow win over Kyrgyzstan. And in the ASEAN Women's Championship in Vietnam, where they lost by big margins to Thailand and the host Vietnam, and could only secure a 1-1 draw with Cambodia in the group stage. So they exited at that phase as well. And in the SEA Games, all they had was just that one win to reach the semi-finals, that 3-1 win over Singapore in their second group stage game, and that was sufficient for them to finish second out of a three-nation group. And they were actually bolstered by those players who were naturalized this year. I mean, even though their first choice goalkeeper Iris Dero was not available, they still had a few notable new additions in Felicia Dizil, Isa Wobbs, who were instrumental in the Merah Putih overcoming an early one goal setback to win 3-1. It was the individual skill alongside with the introduction of their record top scorer Claudia Schunemann to complete that victory that they needed just to be the last four of the women's SEA Games. And what was in a way impressive was that the female Garudas, they were training despite a change of coaches after the failure in the ASEAN Women's Championship. And that saw the previous head coach who led the women to win the AFF Women's Cup to qualify for the ASEAN Women's Championship as champions of that tournament last in 2024, but they were unable to go further despite having more naturalized players. So there's still a notable gap between the local born and the foreign born players. And the foreign born players, while they were good, they didn't look like they had the level where they could really trouble Vietnam, Philippines, and Thailand. Yeah, these are still the big three when it comes to women's football. So that gap is still huge. And back to the men's side, with the introduction of Cliver and his Dutch coaching staff, it became quite clear that the local bonds will be sidelined even more for the rest of the World Cup qualifying that was held in 2025. And Cliver's decision, the coaching staff's decision to implement a more open play policy saw disastrous result against Australia before reverting back to the wingback formation that Shin Tae-yong used very effectively during his time in charge, where they narrowly beat China and Bahrain, but still succumbed to a 6-goal loss in Japan, despite Japan fielding an almost entirely second string 11 for that dead rubber game as far as the Haji Moriyasu's men were concerned. So then to the playoffs, a narrow loss to Iraq despite taking despite taking the lead, and losing to Saudi Arabia in the second half that saw frustrated fans throw water bottles, and eventually you can say it was done and dusted as far as those World Cup dreams that the Indonesian fans have been talking online, have been raising such high hopes for throughout the whole year and the last year, ever since Shin Tae-yong brought them to World Cup qualification dreamland. Now, beyond the men's national team, the under 23 as well as the women's squad, the youth age groups, they did relatively alright, especially their under 17s, where they managed to reach the FIFA Under 17 World Cup, which was held in Qatar, and for a second successive finals appearance, and they actually recorded their first ever World Cup win. Yes, the World Cup win, whether it's the men or the women, their first World Cup win in their victory over Honduras but it was not good enough for them to progress as one of the best third place teams in the 48 nation tournament into the round of 32, which was a pity. But the Indonesians had a tough group where they also had Brazil and Zambia in the midst. So with that victory, they show that at least the young Indonesians are still able to carry the hopes of the football crazy nation to bring to the next few, to form the core that could push Indonesian football to greater heights. And that will be crucial because the naturalization scheme, which was initiated by Eric Dohill, which began with the massive Dutch heritage influx into the squad, where the men are concerned, I think that's where that naturalization would eventually boil over, as it had happened for the men. Risky Rido, the local born centre back who was entrusted by Shinteo to be part of the three-man defence alongside Captain Jay Izzers and Justin Hubner, was sidelined under Clivert. He was either not called up, or even when he was called up, he made only one start in the Clivert reign and spent much of the time either as a late substitute or on the bench without appearing at all. And the thing is, as I mentioned in a few videos where I talk about Indonesian national team World Cup qualifying matches, that for the Indonesians, I think you do need the local born influx, whether it's your Marcelino Ferdinand, Rizky Rido, or your Sayuri brothers, because they form really the core of what it really means to be Indonesian, alongside those Dutch born players who raise the level in terms of their competitiveness, their football know-how that had been honed from those clubs in Europe before switching international allegiance to Indonesia. So, where that is concerned, it is pretty clear that the under Kluivert, he clearly favoured a more open Dutch attacking system. He clearly favoured the Dutch-born players more, which also eventually somehow led to the sidelining of Justin Hubner and a few others who were used more regularly under Shin. And that saw, you can say, an evident divide. It's like he clearly favoured those Dutch players a lot more than the local bonds. Marcelino wasn't always available in the Kluivert era, and the end result was they were able to match the Arabs, but when it came to the crunch, not that good enough to push over the line. Perhaps there is still a considerable gap between those who are capable of playing at a good level in Asia and those who are still in Europe, like their captain Jay, just who is still playing in Italy in Serie A, having made the switch from Venezia, who was relegated last season, to Sassuolo, who turning out for, or Kevin Dix, who is actually turning out and performing well for Borussia Mönchengladbach in the Bundesliga. But there aren't that many who are on that level. And this is where you bring in a very curious turnaround when it comes to those Dutch-born players, especially for Indonesian top-tier champions, Persib Bandung, who retained their top-flight championship last season before the Liga 1 branding was renamed into the Indonesian Super League once more for this season. So for Persib, they invested heavily into their playing squad, especially when they learned their lessons from their painful elimination from the AFC Champions League 2 group stage last season. And this time they bolstered in not just with new foreign signings, but also notably Iliano Reinders and Tom Hay were also signed for Persib Bandung to bolster the quality in centre midfield and also in the fullback department. And that bolstering, as well as Bojan Hodak's know-how in the Asian game, saw Persib go all guns flying in the ACL2 this season, which was perhaps aided by PSSI's decision to attempt not to send the league champions and the cup champions, but perhaps the second place and third place team in last season's top flight to compete in the ASEAN Club Championship Shopping Cup, but was eventually rejected by the ASEAN Football Federation. So that turned out to be a blessing in disguise, as Persib did not have the overburdening match schedule that they struggled with last season when they were playing on both fronts. And that saw Persib emerge from the All ASEAN ACL2 group stage this season to finish top ahead of Bangkok United, with the 24-25 ACL2 finalists Lion City Sailors and Selangor eliminated from the competition. And in the round of 16 of the ACL2 knockout phase, first knockout phase, they are now Persib are drawn to play against another Southeast Asian club or another Thai club, this time Ratchaburi. And this, I think the Persib fans will be awaiting with a lot of keen interest, especially they want to see how far they can go. Because should they defeat Ratchaburi of Thailand, they will face either Pohang Steelers or Gamba Osaka in the quarterfinals. And should they somehow overcome that as well, then they could also end up facing, I think, one of the other half of the East bracket. And should they reach the final, a potential grand final encounter against the likes of Cristiano Ronaldo, Sadio Mane, and those in Saudi representative club Al Nassr awaits. This time round, which will be held in the West Zone after Singapore hosted the ACL2 final as the East Zone final representative last year. But you can see how much investment Persib has been funding and bolstering in such a massive scale this year in their bid to join the likes of Buriram United, Johor Darul Taksim, and to a certain extent Lion City Sailors. Yep, where they want to strengthen their quality and depth of the squad so that they can compete on all fronts, and especially keep the title for in hoping to keep their top flight championship for the third successive season. So for Persib Bandung, this is where I think they want to go further, having improved from a rather poor Asian outing last season, and are still in a good place in the knockout rounds in this season's ACL2 heading into 2026. And then what about the other clubs? Well, for PSM Makassar, they actually reached the semi-finals of the ASEAN Club Championship Shopee Cup last season, where they eventually lost, and also they also reached the semi-finals of the AFC Challenge League as well. And Madura United, they also the other Indonesian representative in the third tier AFC Challenge League, they also reached the semi-finals before losing, I think, before getting knocked out in the eliminated in the knockout phase. So in looking over all these things, at the club level, it's still pretty healthy. It still looks pretty healthy at this moment. But in the national team front, there are some concerns right now, because PSSI president is still Eric Thohir. He's still the man calling the shots in Indonesian football. But sacking Shin could be the biggest mistake in his presidency, because for those 5 years that Shin has built up the Indonesian squad to be more than competitive in Asia and to match against the likes of the top ranked nations in the continent, to faltering at the crucial moments against the Arabs, while still managing to beat the second tier or the middle rank Asian teams, but not competing at the highest level in Asia in the national team level. So where that was concerned, Shin sacking would be the costliest mistake that the now Indonesian sports minister will regret in the years, because Shin was able to build the young players up to, even though the fundamental techniques are not as superior with that to that of the Koreans or the better nations in Asia, but he built them up with the team spirit, with their hard running, with the willingness to push them over the line, to show them how they can compete in Asia, bringing them the belief that the local bonds lack previously. But now the local bonds believe that they can do it. and the Indonesian fans were made to dream because of the legacy Shin had built during those years he had as the Garuda's head coach, who also nearly brought the Indonesia under 23 to the 2024 Paris Olympics men's football tournament. So, on that front, to sack Shin at the start of 2025 when the work was not yet done could well be the biggest mistake ever, because the Clivert experiment was attempted and failed in less than a year. Appointed in February, March, gone by November. That was very short, and much of his coaching staff did not even stay on, with assistant coach Alex Pastoor commenting on Dutch television a month after the sacking that the environment that the Dutch coaching staff were operating was less than ideal for them to push, and Alex Pastoor, in his opinion, had felt that the Indonesians were already more than good enough, had overachieved by being in the fourth round of the World Cup Asian qualifying, when he probably had felt that they were probably not at that level, not even with the Dutch players that they had at their disposal. So, in that regard, it draws again to that uncomfortable question on the influx of the heritage players, even though all the paperwork that PSSI had shown was proven to be legitimate, legal, and valid under FIFA regulations. And now, Indonesia are without the head coach for the men's national team, and with 1 year to go before the 2027 AFC Asian Cup finals in Saudi Arabia, 2026 is that 1 year where Indonesia will have to use to prepare for a second successive finals appearance. I mean, where after they reached the round of 16 for the first time ever in the 2023 edition held in Qatar in January 2024. So, who is that new head coach for the Garudas who will be able to bring out the best in the likes of Jay Itzes, Tom Hay, Iliano Reinders, Kevin Dix and company, and to be able to mold not just the Dutch players but also the best local born players into a cohesive unit the way Shin had managed in the previous Asian Cup finals campaign. And that is the challenge that PSSI has to consider, and they have to make a decision fast and stick with that head coach until the Asian Cup is over, because now they are without Clivert. Who can they turn to in hope to repeat yet another round of 16 appearance? That will be a challenge. And also, who are they going to, given that the only major tournament they have before the Asian Cup finals is the ASEAN Championship or the AFF ASEAN Hyundai Cup, which will be held in July and August. Will this be an opportunity for the new head coach to give Asia a glimpse of what he will do, even with or without some of the players who may not be released by the European clubs or American clubs ahead of the upcoming 26-27 domestic campaigns? So, how to mold them into an effective unit, to understand the tactics, to bring that to make them work together as a unit, to bring out the best in both the local bonds and the Dutch heritage players. That is the key role whoever takes the hot seat as Garuda's head coach will have to fill. Clivert had failed to fill Shideo's big shoes. The next one to come in will have that undeniable challenge ahead in trying to, at least in that short space of time, 1 year, to prepare thoroughly and also to show that they can match that round of 16 outcome that they had in Qatar. Then what about the clubs? Without the Shopee Cup this season, which was a bit controversial, I think perhaps PSSI had an idea in which that in having those second, third place teams to have a taste of overseas competition, even if it's not at the Asian level, this could be a time for them to get a taste so that they know what they have to do. And their Indonesian representatives in the AFC Challenge League, they actually have, both of them have once again reached the quarterfinals of the 25-26 Challenge Cup. Now, with that in mind, for the Indonesian clubs is how do they build on those victories so that eventually Indonesia will have two representatives in ACL2, just as Singapore have, just as Thailand have, yeah, or even better, gain enough ranking points so that one day Indonesia could have one club in the in the highest level of Asian club football competition in the AFC Champions League Elite. So on that front, this is one area for the PSSI to consider, yeah, for the and for Eric Thohir to chew on, even though he's more likely to focus on the national teams. Then, but otherwise, the women would not have anything to do for 2026 because they did not qualify for the Women's Asian Cup. So, how is Eric Thohir going to try to accommodate the women will be another interesting angle to look at, given his dual role as PSSI head and as sports minister, which was especially approved by FIFA president Gianni Infantino. So on that front, I think what we are going to see in 2026 will be mainly how the Garudas are going to perform, how Persib is going to keep the flag flying in the ACL2, and also I think the other representatives, and also for Dewa United Banten, who have reached the quarterfinals of the 25-26 AFC Challenge League knockout rounds. So where they will actually face Manila Diga in the eastern region, where the winner of that quarterfinal will face either Phnom Penh Crown or Sering for a place in the Challenge League final. And that, if both Indonesian clubs, Persib and Dewa, continue to progress well, we could see, you can say, a return to sooner rather than later, a return to a good level, or even better, a club in the AFC Champions League Elite, even though at this moment there's still a gap based on the points ranking system. But crucially for the Indonesian men, how is the new coach going to rebuild the more competent Garuda team that will be more than capable of mixing with the big boys in the Asian Cup finals in Saudi Arabia in January 2027? And that 2026 will be key to see how they're going to either build up or falter. And whoever, and what Vietnam had already done with getting Kim Sang-sik, who is quite close to emulating Park Hang-seo, will Indonesia try the same route, or will they still try for something exotic again to pander to the foreign-born players at the expense of the locals? Because the legacy set by Shin Tae-yong is a very high bar. Can the new head coach do the same? I think this is what we have to watch out for Indonesian football in 2026.